Good morning and happy Sunday. Thank you for watching this video this morning and continuing our study through 1 Samuel with me. We are going to be starting today in chapter 16 and moving our way through chapter 20. So 4 chapters and hopefully about 20 minutes. So let's get started. A short recap, if you will. A precious fruit is born to a barren woman. Samuel is given to Hannah in her moment of desperation. Little does she know that this boy, her young boy, will grow up to be the high priest, will take the position of kind of the evil high priest Eli and be his adopted son, despite Eli having 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, who end up being evil. Samuel becomes that adopted son who rightly grows into the position, ends up being a godly man and a good judge and a person that Israel desperately needed. But Israel is not satisfied with Samuel. They instead ask for a king. This disheartens Samuel, but more importantly, it grieves Yahweh that his people are not content with him. So he goes on and allows Israel to appoint Saul. So Samuel comes across Saul, anoints him as the king. Saul seems to be a great leader, a righteous pick from God, but Saul fails. Saul sins against God, sins against Samuel, sins against his son, and sins against the people of Israel. And that brings us into chapter 16. Before the battle at Michmash, which is chapters 13 through 14, Saul has already been rejected as king. In the next story, you see of his son Jonathan, who seems to be the right fit. He's going to be the next guy to inherit the kingship. Jonathan is a man of God. He fights battles and wins due to the Spirit of God coming upon him. He seems to be the right pick. But because of Saul's sins, Jonathan will never inherit that throne. So there is, like we mentioned last week, and as I kind of just touched on in the intro here, or a recap, there is a kind of adopted son illusion that moves throughout the book of Samuel. Just like Samuel was the adopted son for Eli, being better than his biological sons, so Saul is an adopted son for Samuel. Saul ends up being the righteous man where Samuel's sons failed to be. And again, we're going to have the same illusion here with Saul and David. The difference, though, is that there was really nothing unrighteous about Jonathan. It's just that he was not the one chosen by God. So David still comes in as this adopted son to be the true king. But this brought what is called by some scholars a mimetic rivalry, which is pretty much just jealousy. It's seeing someone else who desires something, and then that causes you to desire that same thing. It's like if you see someone driving in a really nice car, you may have been content in your own car, but the fact that they have that one and they like it and it's nicer and other people like that, you now want that. That seems to be what happens with Saul over and over and over again in the book of Samuel, specifically in chapters 18, 19, and 20. You see this brought out in chapter 18, verses 6 through 8, where when David begins to win battles, Saul becomes jealous. He becomes suspicious of David's popularity. He becomes fearful of David's successes. He becomes suspicious of his own son being a friend to David and rejoicing in David's victories. And then he even goes so far as blaming his son in chapter 22 for David, in a sense, turning against him, which was due to Saul's own doing and it didn't have anything to do with Jonathan. Jonathan, however, provides an example of a godly man who resisted envy and jealousy and the violence that often accompanies it. Just like when Saul would become jealous, he then would bring about actions and bring about circumstances to kill David or to trap David, which we're going to see here several times in the next couple of chapters. Instead of fearing or hating David, which Jonathan could have, because think about this, Jonathan would have been the rightful heir to the throne, but because of Saul's actions, that's not going to happen, and instead, David's going to come up and be the king. Jonathan could have hated David, been jealous of David for taking what was rightfully his, but he's not. Instead, he actually loves David. Instead of clinging to his privileges that this throne would have given him at the time as being the son of the king, he doesn't throw any of that weight around. Instead, he rejoices in David's accomplishments. He rejoices in the fact that David would even be the next king. This becomes even more impressive when you think about the age difference between Jonathan and David. Follow this timeline here for a second. In 2 Samuel 5:4, we learn that David takes the throne when he's 30 years old. In Acts 13 and verse 21, we read that Saul reigned for 40 years. This puts David being born in about the 10th year of Saul's rule. Now, Jonathan, if you remember, was fighting battles with Saul in Saul's 3rd year of his reign, which means that Jonathan is at least 30 years older than David. So not only did Jonathan, no doubt, have this mentality for a long time that one day I'll be king, one day I will lead Israel, and he seemed to have been a righteous man. He seemed to have been a good man to have led. But because of his father's actions, the throne will no longer be his, and instead this little boy will take his place. That would have caused me a lot of jealousy, a lot of envy, a lot of hate. But Jonathan doesn't display any of those things. Jonathan is a true man of God. This isn't to belittle David at all. It's not that Jonathan was just a greater person than David was. No, David's actions, through David's actions, we see an almost reversing of all of the evil that Saul did. We see this primarily through the way that David handled leadership, and especially through the way he handles his relationships. See, when he is shrewd and patient with his enemies, that's the exact opposite of the way Saul was, and we see that ends up being commended by God. With his allies, he's faithful yet firm in the way he follows God's commands and keeps God as a priority. In doing all of these things, he seems to almost be on this path to reverse Saul's sins. It's qualities like this, the faithfulness and the firmness with our friends, and the shrewdness and the patience with our enemies, those are qualities that we should strive to have as people belonging to the church. And it's qualities that we should look for in our leaders, in the elders that we appoint to positions of authority, as well as the ministers we choose to come in and lead us and teach us. But all that's just kind of a rough overview of what we need to get into. If you want to take a moment to pause the video right now, I'd love for you to read the latter part of chapter 15 through chapter 16 and verse 23. And after you've done that, let's talk a little bit about it. And this kind of plays into the whole divine sovereignty and human responsibility argument. I'm sure Yahweh wanted Saul to do good, but Saul did not obey. He did not take on the responsibility as he should. And so he moves this sovereignty, his plan, he moves it in line now with David. And now it is up to David to live up to the responsibility. Divine sovereignty and human responsibility in tension. We see something here also that's going to come out several times in the book of Samuel, and it's God telling people to intentionally deceive other people. And before we get too deep on it, because I would love to make a whole video just on the idea and teaching of lying and deception, because this even goes back to Joshua with Rahab lying in order to protect the spies. Here, Yahweh tells Samuel to not give Saul the whole truth so that Samuel won't be hurt, because at this point we can see that Saul is a little bit explosive, a little bit unpredictable. An interesting point here to note about Yahweh and the things that he does throughout the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. David is chosen, anointed, and the Spirit of God is placed on him in chapter 16 and verse 13 through Samuel appointing him to kingship. And although Saul reigned for another 10 years at least, Yahweh was with David. It's because of Saul's disobedience and nothing else. Because of Saul's disobedience, the Spirit of God leaves him and comes to David. David is now the spiritually superior leader, and Saul is dependent on him. Just as we see with Saul moving in with Samuel and Samuel moving in with Eli, David moves in with Saul. He becomes this adopted son. And in bringing bread and wine to move in, it's much like the offer that Samuel made to Eli earlier in the story. Now we get into chapter 17. And if you'd like to take a moment and read the full chapter before we get into it, here's your chance. And after you've read it, let's talk about it a little bit. This is the big story of 1 Samuel, right? It's the one that is told over and over and over again to our children. It's the one that movies have been inspired by. It's one that history has been inspired by in a lot of ways. We use it metaphorically when we talk about overcoming our giants in life. There have been movies, kind of titled after this idea, and probably for a lot of good reasons. But unlike Achilles or Odysseus, David doesn't fight for his own honor. He fights for the honor of his God. And while Saul, a giant in his own right, yet voided of the Spirit, sits idly by with the rest of Israel, thinking that this battle can't be won. Luckily, David comes on the scene. The Gittite giant called Goliath from Gath, try to say that 3 times fast, has interesting origins, and it's probably something to think about here for a little bit. In Joshua chapter 11, when Joshua defeats the Anakim, he sends them, or in a sense exiles them, to 3 different cities. Gath is one of those cities. That means Goliath is most likely a descendant of the Anakim. So here in this battle against the Philistines, in a sense, Israel needs another Joshua to defeat the Anakim again. And here we see David come on the scene. David is another Joshua. He is a great military leader. One of the details brought out about Goliath's armor, because there's a lot of detail given to it, is the term it's descripted by, and that's scales. His armor is said to be like scales, which is actually historically accurate. During this time period, their armor was much like scales in the way it was crafted. But it also gives us an allusion to who Goliath is. He is the snake. He is the snake that stands against Israel, wishing to consume it. And here, David acts as a new Adam. And just like the snake's head should be crushed, David beheads Goliath. Saul's approach is just like the other nation's approach, not like David's approach, full of faith. Just like the Philistines will arm Goliath up to the teeth, Saul tries to do the same thing. Intricate armor, heavy equipment. I'm going to fit you, David, just like the other nations fit their heroes. Saul isn't approaching this with any type of spiritual insight. Instead, it's spiritual blindness and deafness, not realizing that Yahweh fights the battles, not your armor, not your weapons. The weapon that David ends up choosing is really interesting too. In Judges chapter 20 and verse 16, we're told that the tribe of Benjamin are really good with slingshots. In fact, 700 of them can aim a slingshot at a hair and not miss it. You know who's from the tribe of Benjamin? Saul. And in a sense, David is picking the weapon that Saul should be really good with, and that's the weapon he's going to slay the giant. Moving into chapter 18, if you'd like to take a second and read the full chapter, go right ahead. And after you do that, let's talk about it a little bit. David's reputation at this point begins to increase 100-fold. Because he is prospering, as the text will say 3 different times, that word can also be translated as act wisely. So David is acting wisely, and because of him acting wisely, God is allowing him to prosper. And because of this prosperity, not just wealth and health, he doesn't have the kingdom yet. He is prospering in his deeds. He is doing the things God wants him to do, and because of that, he is seen as a good and righteous man. To the point where Michal, who is Saul's daughter, is said to love David. And she's in fact the first woman in all of Scripture to ever be noted of loving a man. There's no doubt that the battle between David and Goliath is significant. But the battle that plays out between David and Saul is really the one that you and I as Christians should look towards more when we try to apply this concept of defeating giants. See, Saul, in a sense, was a giant. He was head and shoulders above every other man. And he's the one who David had the most significant involvement and tension between. Consider David's situation here for a moment. With Goliath, it's pretty straightforward. You walk on a field, you kill the enemy. It's right there. You know who the enemy is. You know he does bad things. You kill him. But the situation with Saul is a lot different. Saul is a man appointed by God. David had to find a way to faithfully serve a demon-possessed, God-anointed king who was his master, who was the whole time trying to kill him. Can we even comprehend the complicated situation David has found himself in? That's often the situation you and I find ourselves in. We are often under the rule of evil people, whether that be politicians, presidents, governors, mayors, or our bosses at work, teachers at school. We're faced with people who have a position of authority. According to Romans 13, we should never try to usurp the authority. We should never try to rebel against the authority. It's our duty as Christians to serve and serve faithfully and diligently, as long as it's in accordance with God's will. And that's what David does at every turn of the road here. See, he displays several different tactics to get away from Saul, to make sure he never harms Saul. And in this, he pursues God and not evil. See, there's several different ways in which he does this. One, he never returns evil or pursues evil. The one exception could be made for chapter 24, verses 1 through 7. But other than that, there's never a time where he pursues or returns evil. He frequently just finds ways to avoid Saul. Either he runs out of the room when Saul throws a spear at him, or he jumps out of a window to avoid his guards, or he flees into the wilderness to escape Saul. And 3, although he verbally confronts Saul at several points, he never tries to instigate the fight. He never tries to start something or say something smart to just get at Saul. And number 4, David actually uses a variety of deceptions. He acts like a madman in Gath so that people don't know who he is. He requests that Michal lie to Saul in order to protect him. He asks Jonathan to deceive his father. David's willing to deploy any methods necessary to do what? To serve his own end? To bring him wealth? No, it's none of those things, is it? It's to show his enemy love. It's to do whatever he can to fulfill God's laws. And while some commentators might condemn David for doing these things, acting shrewd, I personally think he should be commended. He acts like a shrewd serpent for the purpose of loving his enemies. He wasn't weak, he wasn't dumb, he wasn't incapable. It's not that he was running from a fight. It's not that he wasn't standing up for what he believed in. But he knew God would be the one to vindicate him. He had full assurance that God would be God. And he didn't have to be the one to take vengeance, so long as he was patient. You get that from a lot of the Psalms that David ends up writing. So Saul deploys new methods in trying to get at David, to try and lure him away from the throne and maybe just distract him for a little bit. And in doing that, he tries to get David to marry one of his daughters, and that could be twofold. One, so he could keep a closer eye on him, but number 2, hopefully that woman would lead David, would distract him from the throne, would lead him away from the path that Yahweh had already set out for him. It's in doing that, through Saul knowing that in disobedience the Spirit of God leaves a person, that the Spirit of God would leave David, that maybe Saul can hang on to the throne. And in some ways it makes sense that he does this. In chapter 19 and verse 13, when Michal is lying to help David get out of the house and not be captured, we see that she uses an idol, a household idol, to place in the bed. So clearly she was a worshiper of foreign gods, and maybe even had the possibility to lead David astray. But as we read from the text and know David's story, that never happens. So because the tactic of Saul's to get Michal to marry David and lead David away from the path Yahweh had laid out for him, he's got to move on to new methods. So the beginning of chapter 19, we finish out this story with Michal and move into the story with Jonathan and finish out the story of Jonathan in chapter 20. So if you'd like to take a moment and read those two chapters, 19 and 20, go ahead. This is going to kind of close out our study for today. So the whole of chapters 19 and 20 speak about David's attempted escapes from Saul's clutches, but more importantly, him beginning a life in the wilderness for the next 10 years of his life. The next few chapters that we read after chapter 20 are going to be really tough on David. He's in a completely different situation, doing things that we would see as almost incredulous, but for David, they're necessary. Another big point brought up is towards the end of chapter 20 with Jonathan and David's relationship. Now, 19 and 20, we have Jonathan coming to the aid of David 2 different times in order to figure out Saul's intention. One time, Jonathan's successful. He actually deters Saul from trying to kill David. The second time, he's not so successful, and David actually has to flee into the wilderness for the next 10 years. It's also at the end of this chapter where we really don't hear about Jonathan again. But at the end of the chapter, we really get to read about Jonathan and David's love for one another. Now, let's try to understand something here. When a man loves another man, it does not have to be sexual in nature. It does not have to be a homosexual relationship. What you and I often misconstrue when we read texts like this is we read our culture into their culture, when their culture was much different. Daily life, religious services, every facet of living was separated by the genders. Men spent a lot of time with other men. Women spent the majority of their time with other women and the children. There was a very distinct line drawn here. So men developed relationships with men that we would consider really odd. In Africa, right now, if you become friends with somebody, oftentimes you'll hold hands walking down the road. Men will do that with other men. That doesn't mean they have a sexual relationship. It just means that they're good friends. I got to spend a little bit of time in Africa, and I saw it all the time. Men walking down the road holding hands. You and I in our culture would say, oh, that must be a homosexual couple. But that's not the case, is it? It's because we're reading our culture into theirs. Jonathan and David had a real love for one another that was built off a love of self, like it says several times in the text. Jonathan loved David like he loved himself. David loved Jonathan like he loved himself. What commentators will also pick up on is the first chapter of 2 Samuel, where David is speaking of Saul and Jonathan after they've both died, and David will even go as far as to say that Jonathan's love for him was greater than the love of a woman. And people will try to pick up on that as well as a homosexual comment. But it's just not there in the text. If the text wanted to highlight this obvious sin against the Torah, it would have done it. It's willing to do that with David's other sins of adultery, murder, and lying. Why not comment on the homosexual relationship that he had here with Jonathan? The text doesn't say that. So a lot of people have tried to balance out what the text is trying to say here. So hopefully that gives you some points to study on your own, and you can kind of navigate what the text is trying to tell us here. I think, and what I take away from it, is David and Jonathan's pure love they had. That they were willing to enter into a covenant together, to continue to protect one another and one another's families for the rest of their days. And that's beautiful. That's a beautiful promise to make to a best friend. I hope this has been a beneficial study for you. I hope I possibly brought up some points you haven't thought about and something that you could study further on your own. If ever you have any questions about what you have found in your study or what we've talked about in this video, feel free to comment or message me directly. I would love to discuss them with you. If you have any comments, rebuttals, whatever that looks like, contact me. I love to speak to people about God's Word and God's will for them in their lives. I hope you're finding ways to love your neighbor. I hope you're finding ways to show God's love to other people, that you're showing other people His mercy and His grace and His justice and His healing hand during this weird time we're living in. I miss you all. Hopefully I'll get to see some of you soon. Peace and love.